Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Here we dig into the week's most critical reporting, drawing heavily today from Addis Fortune, Ethiopia's main English weekly, to really unpack the country's core structural pressures.
That's the goal, because when you look across the different stories we've been covering, education, finance, infrastructure, energy, you see this recurring theme, this kind of constant friction.
Friction between what, exactly?
Between the high national ambitions, this real drive to modernize quickly, and then the sort of deep underlying structural weaknesses that keep tripping things up.
Okay, so today we're diving right into that friction. We've identified 4 key pressure points from recent reporting. The crisis in education and jobs, the really acute financial vulnerability tied to debt, the physical decay we're seeing in urban infrastructure, and these big conflicts over resource allocation.
And we want to show how these threads are all connected, part of the same complex challenge.
Right. Let's start with education. That's where a country's future really lies, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the Ministry of Education launched this, radical overhaul of the big national secondary school leaving exam. The intentions seemed good, stop the mass cheating, raise the bar, but the outcomes, they've been incredibly stark.
Stark is definitely the word. We reported that over the last 4 years, almost 3 million students sat for this new, tougher exam. But get this, only about 142,600, which is less than 5%, actually scored high enough for university.
Less than 5%.
Yeah.
And it gets worse when you look closer. Last academic year, something like 12,249 high schoolers. Well, they had 0 students pass. Not one.
0.
Yeah.
That's unbelievable. It points to something much bigger than just a hard test.
It's systemic failure, exactly. Not just an exam issue.
And to really understand that number, you have to look at the individual stories. The contrast is just striking. You've got Haymanat Yonas, 18, who got the top score for female candidates, dreaming of a neuroscience. It shows it is possible, right?
Yes, it shows potential exists. But then you hear from students like Hanan Jamal up in Bahir Dar or Iyab Adu in Jimma. This young man was working 2 jobs just to help his family while trying to study.
And they didn't make it.
No. And they talked about real problems with the process itself. Yeah. Chaotic logistics, being sent to unfamiliar test centers, feeling intimidated by the people watching them.
So the takeaway isn't necessarily that raising standards is wrong.
No, not at all.
But that the policy itself is almost irrelevant if the system underneath it is broken. We spoke to experts, people like Professor Chirusu Tefera, and they argue that focusing so much on the exam meant the ministry ended up prioritizing the testing process over actual learning.
Exactly. You can't just change the test. Real improvement means investing in the fundamentals. Teachers who are properly trained, decent textbooks, reliable electricity in classrooms, safe schools. If the classroom is failing, a tougher exam just confirms the failure.
Which then leads to the next problem.
Yeah.
What happens even for the students who do graduate? We're talking over 200,000 graduates every year hitting the job market.
And finding, not much. There's this huge gap, a real structural mismatch between the qualifications people have and the jobs that are actually available.
Oh, graduates like Hannah Solomon told us it feels like an impossible maze out there. So the ministry's response is this new directive.
Right. Mandating all public universities and private colleges set up these employment and entrepreneurship development centers. They have 6 months to do it.
Okay, so what are these centers supposed to do?
Well, the mandate covers quite a bit. Career counseling, trying to match graduates with jobs, setting up incubators for startups, facilitating internships, even doing labor market assessments. It sounds, practical.
It sounds like the right idea, focusing on employability.
On paper, yes. But there's a lot of skepticism. Will these centers actually lead to real skills and jobs, or will they just end up, as one student put it, hosting workshops?
A valid concern.
And economists are cautious too. They say these centers will only work if 2 other things happen. First, universities have to seriously change their courses to match what the private sector actually needs.
Okay, aligning curriculum. Makes sense.
And second, the government needs to figure out how to incentivize businesses to actually create those internships and jobs. Because if the jobs simply aren't there, the centers can't match people to nothing.
Right, they're just shuffling the unemployed. Okay, so that's the human side of fragility, but let's pull back. What about the financial foundation for all this? Section 2, Ethiopia's fiscal reality.
Yeah, this is really the bedrock issue affecting everything else. After Ethiopia missed that $33 million interest payment on its only Eurobond, the IMF and World Bank delivered their verdict. It's official. The country's public debt is now considered unsustainable.
Can you just quickly explain for listeners maybe not following the finance news closely what missing a Eurobond payment actually signals internationally?
It's a major red flag. A Eurobond is debt sold internationally in foreign currency. Missing a payment basically tells the world Ethiopia can't meet its financial obligations right now. It kicks off really difficult, lengthy negotiations with creditors. It's serious.
And the overall debt numbers are staggering. Public debt hit $71.4 billion by June 2024. And our reporting highlighted that yields on Treasury bills, T-bills, are surging past 16%. What does that technical indicator tell us about what's happening inside the country?
It's a huge warning sign flashing red. T-bills are short-term government borrowing domestically. When the yield jumps that high to 16.4%, it means the government has to promise a much higher return to borrow money from its own banks and institutions.
Which tightens things up.
Exactly. It sucks liquidity out of the system for everyone else, for banks, for businesses, and it reflects really high expectations of future inflation. It signals that money is getting very, very tight domestically.
And you can't talk about this debt without talking about the state-owned enterprises, the SOEs. They're a huge part of the picture.
A massive part. The government tried to contain the risk by creating this body, the Liability and Asset Management Corporation, or LAMC.
Right, the LAMC, what was its job?
It basically took on a huge chunk of SOE debt, almost 800 billion birr in liabilities. But here's the crucial part for understanding the risk. 90% of that enormous figure came from just 3 SOEs.
Which 3?
The Ethiopian Sugar Corporation, Ethiopian Electric Power, and the Ethiopian Railway Corporation.
Sugar, power, and rail. Why those specific ones? Is there a common issue there?
They tend to represent these huge, often delayed, state-led infrastructure projects. They rely heavily on government money, borrow a lot domestically, and often struggle with efficiency. The Sugar Corporation in particular has been notorious for projects running way over budget and behind schedule.
So instead of generating revenue, they became a drain.
Pretty much. They embody decades of investment that just didn't produce the expected returns, leaving behind massive debt.
There was one piece of better news, though. Ethiopian Investment Holdings reported big profits, but mostly driven by giants like Ethiopian Airlines and the Commercial Bank.
That's the mixed picture, exactly. You have these profitable giants, particularly the airline, which is a huge success story, and the main state bank. But analysts warn that these outliers kind of hide the deeper systemic problems in most other SOEs, which continue to be what we call a quasi-fiscal burden.
Okay, quasi-fiscal burden, that term comes up a lot. Can you break that down for us? What does it mean in practice?
It means these SOEs are basically covering costs or providing services or subsidies that should technically be funded directly by the government budget, but instead the SOE absorbs the cost or the loss. It messes with market signals and puts huge financial strain on the SOE itself, which of course eventually loops back to the state as more debt risk.
Got it. So the path out, according to the IMF program, involves some really politically painful choices, like letting the currency float more freely and stopping that quasi-fiscal spending.
Extremely tough choices. Our experts emphasize that avoiding, a potential lost decade of growth requires real discipline, getting those SOEs to actually repay their debts and drastically improving tax collection. But these are choices that will seriously test the government's political resolve.
And this intense pressure, the debt, the inefficiency, it's not just abstract numbers. It's showing up in very real, physical ways. Which brings us to Section 3. Structural breakdown on the ground. The news from Aquililand Asco about those apartment blocks, that's deeply worrying.
It's truly tragic. 29 families, about 150 people, forced out of their homes in Block 13, and a public school damaged too. But the experts we talked to say this isn't just shoddy construction.
What else is going on?
It's a failure of urban planning, a really toxic combination. Deforestation, specifically cutting down eucalyptus trees, which used to soak up huge amounts of groundwater, plus a sewage system that was fundamentally flawed. Wastewater basically saturated the loose soil beneath these buildings.
And the damage is severe.
Terrifyingly so. We reported finding cracks going down as deep as 12 meters. The experts are warning, quite bluntly, that without urgent action on drainage and a serious reforestation effort, more collapses like this are basically inevitable.
That kind of fragility, that urban breakdown, connects directly back to the resource constraints we were talking about, right?
Yeah.
Especially with climate change.
Absolutely. It leads straight into this climate spending paradox. The government is committing serious money to climate action, almost 54 billion birr in the next budget. On the surface, that looks like strong political will.
It's a huge figure, more than double the budget for urban food security, for example.
It is. But here's the brutal math, thanks to the debt crisis we just covered. For every single dollar Ethiopia manages to spend on climate adaptation, $10 are being consumed by debt payments.
$10 on debt for everyone on climate. Oof.
It completely changes the equation. Climate policy stops being this forward-looking investment and becomes this desperate scramble for survival under impossible financial constraints. Leaders are making the argument, quite rightly, that Ethiopia is paying an unfair price for a climate crisis. It barely caused them. Africa contributes less than 4% of global emissions.
So they're pushing for grants, not more loans, for climate finance.
Exactly. They argue they simply cannot afford to borrow their way through a climate disaster that they didn't create.
And that theme of resource scarcity is also playing out dramatically in the energy sector, specifically around this conflict over Bitcoin mining. What was the final decision from Ethiopian Electric Power, the EEP?
EEP put its foot down. No new electricity allocations for Bitcoin mining companies.
Even though Ethiopia has some big advantages for miners, right? Super cheap electricity and mostly renewable.
Huge advantages. Electricity rates are incredibly low, like 3.2 to 3.6 US cents per kilowatt hour. And the grid is about 90% renewable energy. The miners argued they were bringing in significant foreign currency, too. Estimates were around $25 to $28 million a month.
That's a lot of hard currency for a country in Ethiopia's financial position, so why turn it down? What was EEP's reasoning?
EEP basically said, look, the power consumption from these operations grew much faster than expected, and we have to shift our strategic priorities. The stark reality is that only about 22% of Ethiopia's population currently has legal access to the electricity grid.
Only 22%, wow.
So the government's position is essentially that they cannot justify allocating potentially limited power resources, and the infrastructure needs to deliver it, to what they call a narrow segment of foreign-owned operations, when nearly 80% of their own citizens lack basic electricity access.
So it's a fundamental choice about priorities, domestic needs versus short-term foreign exchange.
Precisely. It's about fulfilling a core public mandate, rural electrification, powering domestic industry, taking precedence over monetizing surplus energy for potentially temporary financial gains.
That single decision really seems to capture the core theme running through all these Addis Fortune reports this week, doesn't it?
It really does.
If you step back and look at everything we've covered, the exam reforms, the climate commitments, the push for digital industries like Bitcoin mining, every attempt to move forward seems to immediately hit one of these systemic weaknesses, the skills gap, the crushing debt, the failing infrastructure.
Yeah, the common thread across education, finance, energy, infrastructure. It's this fundamental scarcity of resources, both financial and physical. And alongside that, the immense difficulty of trying to implement rigorous, often internationally derived standards, whether it's complex financial auditing rules or new student exam formats, without first fixing the underlying local deficits. Things like adequate funding, proper training, basic infrastructure.
It's like trying to build the top floor of a building before the foundation is stable. The structure just keeps showing signs of strain.
That's a good way to put it. And that leaves you, our listener, with a really challenging question to think about after this deep dive.
Yeah.
Given all these overlapping constraints we've laid out, the unsustainable debt, the desperate need for climate funds, the huge gaps in basic things like power and safe housing, which of these competing crises do you think will force the toughest political trade-off in the next year or so?
And crucially, what desirable short-term policy or goal might end up being sacrificed because of that pressure? That really is the central dilemma facing Ethiopia's leaders right now. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.